We're about to begin our live exclusive event with Rod Dreher here at the UnHerd Club. If you want to watch the whole thing and not just the first 15 minutes, you've got to become a subscriber. Go to unherd.com/live and become a subscriber now, and you can see the whole thing as it happens.
Thank you so much for coming this evening to this special emergency event. We are going to talk about why it is an emergency in a moment. Those of you who are here, of course, will know what we're here to discuss, but just to remind us what the theme is this evening, it's the battle for the soul of the right. Increasingly, there are factions and groups within the political right that are no longer seeing eye to eye. There seems to be a competition to see who can be most forthright/extreme, depending on your point of view. And this is really playing out really in the US over questions like Israel, how to speak about Jewish people and issues, but also a general style of how to talk about women, how to talk about institutions. There's a kind of, there's a gradual movement in the direction of what we're going to be talking about this evening, which are the Gropers. Rod Dreher, who you will know, is a prominent conservative writer. He has written some wonderful books. And we should probably talk about some of them this evening. The Benedict option and Live Not by Lies are two personal favourites. But really, he's just come back from the United States. He's been on a bit of a tour there. And it's fair to say that you were shocked by what you saw. And you've been writing extensively about it and calling out what he sees as the excesses of certain groups on the political right. This really matters because Rod is not a lily-livered liberal. I can assure you, this is not the usual stone throwing at evil right-wingers from people you would expect. This is someone who has profound disagreements with the liberal point of view, so much so that he has moved to Hungary and works for one of the think tanks, the Danube Institute, that is funded by and closely associated with the Orbán government. So it's quite hard to say that he doesn't deserve to be listened to when he is calling out people to his right. So, Rod Dreher, thank you so much for getting on a plane and coming to London for this emergency event, and welcome to UnHerd.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you all for coming and coming out in these emergency conditions.
Yes.
To the bunker.
I'm going to start with just a general question. What did you see when you were in the United States? You mentioned in some of your writing that it reminded you of the Weimar era. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I go back to the US from Hungary every 3 or 4 months. And in the past year, especially just this recent trip to Washington, I've seen this radical turn among young men, particularly young white males, towards the radical right, the anti-Semitic right, the woke right, as some have called it. And I talked to friends of mine across the country who are engaged in teaching high school or teaching university courses to these young men, and they're shocked too by the same thing. And it's all coming from online radicalization. And I compare it to Weimar Germany. I mean, one has to be careful. You know, we haven't had a great war or anything like that. But when you read Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which I did to write my book, Live Not by Lies, so many of the factors that Arendt said are present in a pre-totalitarian society are very present in contemporary America and frankly throughout the West. But so far nobody has picked up on it, and it had not, even when I wrote Live Not by Lies in 2020, I left out Arendt's mention of anti-Semitism because even on the left that wasn't such a big problem then. It's everywhere now, all over the left and the right, and it's concentrated in the young generation. Before I went to Washington, I asked a friend of mine he doesn't live there, but he's very well connected to the highest levels of the Trump administration. I said, how many of these Gen Z people, those born after 1997, how many of them would you estimate are followers of Nick Fuentes, the podcaster, or at least fellow travelers? And he estimated between 30 and 40%. Well, that sounded high to me, so I asked a bunch of friends of mine of that generation in Washington who were traveling in those circles. I put that number to them, and they all said, yeah, that sounds about right. Now, UnHerd's Washington correspondent, Emily Jashinsky, who's of that generation.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, well, no, Emily's a friend, and she did her own reporting, the same sort of reporting I did, calling around, and she found the number was more like 10 to 20%. I hope that's true, but even so, it's striking. I mean, when you actually sit down and talk to young people who are, young conservatives in Washington who are working in conservative institutions or for the administration, who don't go along with this, they are tremendously anxious about it. I talked to this one young man who was a serious Christian, and he's even thinking about getting out of Washington because he finds it so dark and so hard to deal with.
So how do you spot a groyper? What are they? For people who haven't heard that phrase, what are groypers, and what are their kind of telltale beliefs or turns of phrase?
Well, it's funny that you ask me, because I'm 58 years old. I would have no way of knowing who these people are if I weren't on social media and they hadn't become a thing. But groypers is the way that followers of Nick Fuentes, that's the name they have for themselves. Fuentes is a 27-year-old streamer. He does a nightly stream in which he rants about Jews, blacks, immigrants, women. One of his famous quotes is he thinks most women actually want to be raped, etc. And he mixes this insane talk in with an actual critique of the economics and the economic situation for his generation in the US. And he's speaking to young men who feel that they don't have any meaning in their lives, there's no purpose, and this has been taken from them. And of course, those who took it from them, Jews and immigrants. Now, Tucker Carlson, he was a more or less a fringe figure until Tucker Carlson recently invited him onto his very popular show. Tucker is the most influential and popular conservative journalist in America. Even after he left Fox, he has his own thing. Tucker invited Fuentes on for a long interview, which that crossed a line for me because I knew that it would make Fuentes normal and to some degree. But if Tucker gave him a critical interview, as Tucker's perfectly capable of doing, that would have been one thing. But it was a softball interview. Even when Fuentes, he was on his best behavior that night, Fuentes, when he slipped up and said, but you know, I really admire Stalin too. Tucker said, really? We'll have to come back to that. Well, he never did. Now, what concerns me, Freddie, is if the only thing you knew about Nick Fuentes was what you saw on Tucker's broadcast that night, you would think of him as maybe an edgy, jittery young man, guy who seems to have a pebble in his shoe about the Jews, but basically normal. And that's not who Nick Fuentes is. Just this afternoon here in London, I had a drink with a Norwegian friend who happened to be passing through town. His wife is American. His in-laws in America are classic middle American baby boomer evangelical conservatives. They had no idea who Fuentes was until Tucker's show, but they loved Tucker. And they told my friend, said, that Fuentes kid makes a lot of sense. And he had to say, no, you don't understand. That's not who he really is. But this is the danger, I think, is that now the Overton window has been moved in a radical way towards Fuentes.
This is the emergency.
This is the emergency, and it's not. And Trump was finally asked about it. Trump, who has a daughter who converted to Judaism, and he has Jewish grandchildren. Nobody thinks Trump is an anti-Semite, but he was asked about it, and he just sort of, about Tucker having him on, he said, well, I can't tell Tucker who to interview, which is true, but not the point. And JD Vance has not said anything about it either. I think at the core of this crisis is JD Vance, but as the heir apparent to Donald Trump. What is he going to do? And we don't know yet.
Well, we should say you're friends with him, you communicate a lot with him. Is he torn, do you think? He doesn't want to kind of alienate, offend the harder right elements of his base? Or?
Well, I'm the one, according to him, I'm the one most responsible for his career. I mean, he came out with his book, Hillbilly Elegy, in 2016. It had not done much business. One of the readers of my blog at The American Conservative sent me a copy of it. I read it on a flight to Boston, absolutely loved it, tracked him down in England on vacation. He gave me an interview that went mega viral. within a month, his book was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. I wish it was because of my journalistic skill, but it was just one of those things that happen in the internet age. So we've been friends since then. I went to see him in his house when I was in Washington because I wanted to plead with him as a fellow Christian. He's a serious Catholic, and I'm the Orthodox Christian. I said, you gotta say something. You can't let this guy get away with it. Now, I'm not gonna say what his response was, but I will say that he hates Fuentes, it's clear. Fuentes has gone after his wife, Usha, who is of Indian descent. He's called her a Jeet, and condemned JD as a race mixer. So JD has no love for Fuentes, but I think it's fair to say that JD does understand intuitively, because he's 41 years old, he understands the crisis that these young men are facing. He understands that they have been unfairly targeted by the woke left that have taken over all the institutions of American life and for the past 15 years or so. And I think he must be trying to figure out a way to speak to them in a positive way, to acknowledge their grievances, the legitimate ones, but to lead them away from this racist loony.
But would you like to see, both from JD Vance and also President Trump, a clearer rejection of those components? That's what you're calling
for. JD, yeah, because it's important, because this stuff is spreading very quickly, and I think that when it reaches. I'll give you an example. I have a friend, Southern Baptist, ordained pastor, but he doesn't have a church. He's an academic who teaches at a big, prestigious university in the South, a Baptist university. He's 50 years old, and if you're a Southern Baptist of that age, you were raised in a philo-Semitic environment in your churches. Southern Baptists are particularly known for their love of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. But he's seeing kids his son's age, young men who are all uniformly Jew haters. And that's the word he used. And he asked them, where did this come from? It's all online. And the older people my age and the boomers, we're not prepared for this. We did not grow up in a country like this, and we're not in the same online space as these kids. So a lot of us don't know how to respond. And so I think we're trying, if we know about it at all, we're trying to hope that it passes quickly, but it's not gonna.
What is the worst case scenario, do you think? I mean, obviously by talking about the Weimar era, you invite the Nazi era as a potential successor. And normally, people are allergic on the political right to invoking the Nazis because they're so used to being called Nazis themselves. Yeah. But you seem to have done that quite deliberately. Why?
Well, Freddie, in my book, Live Not by Lies, I wrote about what I call soft totalitarianism, which is the totalitarianism that had emerged in a softer way on the left in the woke era. And I wrote about it that way because in 2015, I began to meet people who had come to America to escape Soviet communism, who were saying the things we're seeing happen now remind us of what we left behind. And my thought was, oh, come on, really? Where are the gulags? Where's the KGB? But the more I talked to them and thought about it, the more I realized they were talking about the spread of a mentality that allowed only one way to think about things, that punished people who didn't agree by taking their jobs away, by ruining their reputation, by attacking their businesses and so forth. And in that book, I drew the parallel. I said, this is not communism, but it is a form of totalitarianism, much more Brave New World than Orwell's 1984, because it depended on a sense of safety, wanting safety. If you shut up any dissenters, you have safety. And I saw that on the left, and I thought the right would be resistant to it. However, earlier this year, I was in the US, Angel Studios made a streaming documentary about Live Not by Lies, where we went and interviewed some of these dissidents living in Central Europe. And during the Q&A, a woman in Nashville asked, well, aren't you relieved that President Trump is in power and the totalitarianism troubles have passed? I said, no. I said, yes, I'm relieved Trump is in office and is pushing back on wokeness, but the conditions that Hannah Arendt laid out for the emergence of totalitarianism have not been dealt with. And we could easily see this uprise on the right too. And I don't want to live in a right-wing totalitarian society any more than I want to live in a left-wing one. And
you think there's a serious risk of that?
I think it is. I think we can't identify, there is our new Hitler. No, but as Matthias de Smet, I think he's a Belgian sociologist, has written about the psychology of mass formation. His work intersects greatly with Hannah Arendt's work in The Origins of Totalitarianism. He says that Hitler was emerged from something. Hitler didn't cause it as much as he emerged from it. And what did he emerge from? He emerged from a society that was where loneliness and social atomization was everywhere, where people had no sense of meaning or connection, and they were full of free-floating anxiety and frustration and anger. And because of that, they gave themselves over to conspiracy theories. Find a scapegoat, almost always the Jews, but not only the Jews. Find a scapegoat, find solidarity in connecting with these scapegoats, and open yourself up to simplistic solutions that'll take care of all the problems. Now, Matthias de Smet said that under these conditions, 30% of the people will completely believe this narrative. Another 30% will reject the narrative, but they will be persecuted for it. But the greater number of people will ignore it, they don't want to get involved, they don't want to risk any conflict, and they just go with the flow. Arendt herself, in Origins, said that she held the German middle class, the bourgeoisie, chiefly responsible for the rise of Hitler because they should have known better. But they chose not to get involved, thinking everything would be okay and that Hitler could be controlled. This is what I worry about for my own country, and frankly, it's what all of us in the West should worry about. I follow David Betts and others in France who are talking about the possibility of civil war, and a fascist leader or a far-left leader could emerge out of that.
So that's partly why you're speaking out against people on the political right.
I mean, you have to stop it now, you know, and Matthias de Smet also said the only way to stop it is to speak truth. Now, the people who are so given over to this narrative, they abandon reason entirely. You can't reach them. But if you can reach the broader middle that can be converted, so to speak, or can be educated to say, hey, you've got to stand up here. Now, I'm not doing this, as you said, I'm not doing this as a leftist. I'm doing this as someone on the right, and even the post-liberal right, who says, nevertheless, I don't want that. And we could get that if we're not careful.
Let's dig into kind of where your red lines are, because I think that will be really useful for everyone. So obviously anti-Semitism is the sort of central charge against Fuentes and the Gropers. I mean, there are others which we'll come to, but that's really at the heart of it. And it seems to me there's a sort of spectrum, isn't there? There's from the kind of corporate, traditional, old school Republican who won't hear a word said against whatever Israel does, right through to people who describe themselves as quote unquote realists, who are prepared to think about a more America first, slightly more isolationist, although they might not use that phrase, foreign policy where a bit more distance from Israel would be wise, right through to people who then kind of also see Jewish presence in society as an epitome of a kind of globalized world, and they think that's something they feel unhappy or unsettled about, right through to out-and-out anti-Semitism. Where do you draw the line?
That's an important question. I had been friends with Tucker Carlson for years, and after he left Fox in April 2023, he started his own show, and he pretty much from the get-go went dark. He infamously had on this so-called amateur historian, Darryl Cooper, who said that Churchill was the great villain of World War II, and wait, what's all this? And but out of respect for our friendship, I didn't say a lot, but I did resolve in my mind at some point, if he ever has Fuentes on, that's when I'm going to have to speak out. And I did, right after he had Fuentes on. I said, you've crossed the Rubicon here. And he sent me a text calling me a weak man, and that ended our friendship. And I said, I'm happy to take that from you, given what you've done.
This was last week then?
This a couple weeks ago, yeah. And so, that's unpleasant, but sometimes you have to take a stand. Loyalty is a virtue until it becomes a vice, right? But I think anti-Semitism is a clear red line. And I've been to Auschwitz, and when you've been there, as many of you know, probably have, and you look, I'm thinking now of like the pile of little children's clothes taken off of little Jewish children before they were sent to the showers and then to the ovens. You realize this is not something to joke about, ever. It has to be taboo. Now, the Gen Z people, the Gen Z guys are so sick of being policed by the woke about what they can and can't say that they're pushing back, and they don't want any limits on what they can say because they're angry. And I think we have to acknowledge that woke policing in some sense provoked this. I'm not saying what about, but I'm saying that this is what formed them. And they were formed in a culture that told them everything wrong in the world is the fault of you, white male. And
just to stick on the Israel question, or the Jewish bit, because that does seem at the heart of it. Like, would you go along with, in fact, and agree with people on the political right who wanted America to be more realist in terms of its role in the world, maybe less less consistently supportive of Israel, more critical, of more distanced, basically? Up to that point, you feel comfortable?
Well, I am generally in favor of a more realist American foreign policy. That's why I've been opposed from the beginning to America's attitude towards the Ukraine war, not out of any love of Russia, but just because we can't. I grew up in the era, or spent most of my career in the era of forever wars, and I'm against that. But on the question of Israel, I'm a supporter of Israel. I don't apologize for it. I don't see where they had any choice after October 7th. That said, I don't believe that any criticism of Israel is off limits or anti-Semitic. And I think that, and even American Jewish leaders now know that it's the golden age of America's support for Israel is over, But I think that we have to permit some criticism, legitimate criticism of Israel and its role in American foreign policy and in the world. That said, it's amazing how quickly it elides from criticizing the actions of the state of Israel to conspiracy theories about the Jewish people. And I think one way you can tell this is if people hold Israel to a double standard, if they would not criticize any other nation for different actions it takes, but they do criticize the state of Israel, you have to wonder why that is. But generally speaking, yes, we do need to allow for more criticism of the state of Israel. And we who support Israel shouldn't be afraid of that, because there is a moral and a strategic case to be made for Israel. And we need to admit when Israel does wrong.
So you're not condemning young Americans who want America to extricate itself from foreign entanglements, including Israel. That's the kind of the softer end of the Tucker Carlson sort of group, isn't it? You don't have a problem with them, even though you may take a different view. You're not condemning them for that, as long as it stops short of anti-Semitism. Yeah, America can't be the world's policeman anymore. The world has changed. It's a multipolar world, and I think that I remember, Freddie, I was a journalist in New York on 9/11. I was standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, watched the South Tower fall. I was so traumatized by that I believed whatever my government told me to justify dropping bombs on Muslims. But I didn't put it that way to my mind. I would have immediately recognized that as intellectually corrupt. And so I bought all this stuff about we have to fight them over there so we don't fight them here. About 3 years into the war, I realized my mistake, and that my mistake had come from a place of anger and trauma, and the war was unjust. And so it made me start thinking in a very different way to the Republican parties, the Reagan-era Republican Party, which is what I grew up in. I started thinking in a very different way about that, and I still do believe that. And therefore, it has to be okay to criticize Israel too. But we have to draw a bright, clear line at anti-Semitism. The other kind of Fuentes style of anti-Semitism is a sense that Jewish people cannot be loyal to the state of the United States. Somehow they're, by belonging to a kind of minority that is globally connected, they are somehow intrinsically untrustworthy. Do you think there's a correlation there between talk about Muslims and Islam and what is now inevitably happening towards Judaism? And you yourself have been very critical of Islam, and that is very, I would say, on the front pages of most conservative journals. do you think that opens the door to anti-Semitism by making it okay to distrust people for having a different religion?
Well, it could, but it shouldn't. I mean, this is a classic anti-Semitic trope, the dual loyalty. In fact, in the Weimar years in Germany, the German Jewish war veterans who had served with great distinction, they were not allowed to join war veterans organizations. They had to form their own to defend their own Germanness. They were heavily assimilated, and yet it didn't matter in the end because they were accused. You can never be really German, and this is not just Germany. This is France and everywhere else. So I think that it is a canard, and but at the same time, it's fair to ask of any religion or any group of people, can you assimilate into a society? Do you have a wish to do that? And I think in the United States, and no doubt in this country too, Jews have done that. They have assimilated very well. They're patriotic. And you can't say the same thing about all Muslims. Yes, there are Muslims who do, but I'm sitting here in London. I don't have to make a strong case that there are a number of Muslims who reject Western society explicitly and have no intention of assimilating. I don't think it should be off limits, whatever Keir Starmer says, to criticize religious people, even Christians, like the Christian nationalists in America, to question whether your religious commitment, how committed are you to the social order we have now. And I say that as someone who, as a Christian, has been critical of certain aspects of the social order in the United States, but my loyalty to America, I hope it never comes into question.
So
if you're seeing my face, that means you've come to the end of your 15-minute free preview. But the good news is, if you want to carry on watching this exclusive live event with conservative thinker Rod Dreher from the UnHerd Club, then all you have to do is go to unherd.com/live and become a subscriber now. You'll get everything UnHerd has to offer, and you can pick up exactly where you left off. That's unherd.com/live. What are you still doing here? If you want to get all the gossip on what Rod Dreher, conservative thinker all the way from Budapest, has to say about the MAGA movement and the schisms inside it, then you need to keep on watching. Go to unheard.com/live. You can pick up the event where you left off, and you'll also get everything UnHerd has to offer. That's all of our long-form journalism, video interviews, and so much more. Go to unheard.com/live now.